Here we go. Good morning. Good morning, Robertson County. What is going on? This is 1100 WSGI, and good second day after Christmas. A lot of folks taking a day off because, hi, I'm U-Turn Laverne. This is One Street Over, and we're going to talk about some of the things going on One Street Over from where we are this morning. And this is one of those days, it's kind of one of those, weird days because some people took Thursday and Friday last week, because anytime holidays fall on the weekend, then we get a day before or a day after, because we don't get our holiday because it falls on a day we normally get off. So it's kind of weird. Some people will be off today. I know my husband was trying to get over to the DMV to take a test for bus driving, and they were supposed to be open on Thursday and they weren't there, so we're hoping they'll be there today. So I don't know. I don't think anybody can decide what day they want to take off and what day they don't want to take off, but if you've got an extra day off today, good for you. Enjoy it. We want to come to you. This is one of those things. Everybody asks me why I don't normally, take much time off from radio. It's like in my backyard, practically. It's so easy to get here. It's 2 miles from my house, and I just kind of like doing this. It's a lot of fun. I like checking in with you guys and seeing what's going on. And we've got, I don't know, it's kind of like, it seems like we have extra days this week or this month. We have some extra time, it seems like, just to kind of get some recaps on some things that are going on in our community. And one of the things that I want to check in with, well, now tomorrow I'm going to be checking in with my friend Debbie Keenan. She is with the Keenan group, and she's always fun to talk to because, well, she's my buddy. And also, too, they have this Let's Talk Trash thing that they do in the local paper in our Robertson County Connection. And they also have a program where they're going to be doing this art project that helps bring awareness to the fact that we need to keep, things clean. We need to not litter. We used to have the Native American with the tears running down his face whenever we were all kids. At least if you grew up in the 60s and 70s, that's our memory of don't litter. And we were, that's how we were taught to take care of our planet. Well, now they do it in a lot of different ways, and they have this Let's Talk Trash program, and they have this really cool thing that they're gonna decorate these irises with things that they find littering, and then they're going to auction them off to raise money. It's a really cool program, and so she's going to be kind of filling me in on that tomorrow, talking to us about that and some of the other things that she has going on, because she is very involved in the community and gotten really involved here in Robertson County in the last year. So we're going to talk to Debbie tomorrow, and then again later in the week, I've got a couple of businesses that I'm reaching out to that I haven't ever talked to that I want to just bring in and kind of let you know what's going on with them. I'm hoping to have a couple of new guests that I've never had. Excuse me, but so that's the kind of thing that we've got going on. Ace says she's going to be here on Thursday. Ace Timbermeyer, Ace Timbermeyer, Brian Pulley from United Way. They check in with us every week because they always bring interesting stuff and keep us up to date on the nonprofits going on. All the stuff going on with our nonprofits around. So that's kind of what we're unpacking this week. And as we, kind of roll into the new year, we'll see what happens. But I appreciate you joining us this morning if you're with us, and hope you'll stick around to hear from Stephen Skelton. I don't know if I even mentioned that that's who's coming in. He's actually going to be via phone. He actually lives south of Nashville, so it's a little bit difficult. He and actually there's one other guy that I'm trying to get in studio, but some of these guys that live a little far away that I love having in, it's a little bit hard for them. And today, Stephen, his mom's had some health issues, so he's taking care of that. So he's going to be calling in on the phone lines, and we're going to be talking to him because Stephen's program, the American Bible Project, has just exploded. Some of the things that are going on, and I thought it'd be really fun to get an update from him about where we are in the project, unpack it, and kind of explain what it is if you've never heard of it. But we're going to be talking to Stephen Skelton this morning as soon as he calls in. So we're waiting for his phone call here in just a few minutes. He's supposed to call me right about 7:05, because I told him, I said, it takes me about 5 minutes to say hello to everybody. And so anyway, Steve's going to be calling in here in just a minute. I've had a lot of people ask me about how are things in Mayfield. They're exactly as you would think they are. And just keep praying for Mayfield and Dresden and Princeton and Russellville and Dawson Springs and Bowling Green and all parts in between that were devastated by the tornadoes. Just keep those prayers coming. That is what they want most from you right now. And here is Stephen. We're going to bring him on. Stephen, are you with us, my friend?
Hi, Laverne. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you today? Everything
Doing good,
great?
doing good.
How's mom? I
Yes.
told people, I said your mom's been under the weather. She's been in the hospital. I mean, that's always anytime something hits you that's unexpected health issue, but especially during the holidays. Yikes! I mean, how's she doing?
Yes, well, the good news is she's coming home tomorrow,
Oh, yay!
and so we're looking forward to that. Thanks for asking.
Absolutely. Are y'all going to do a late Christmas then? Y'all got to do
Yes,
a
we will.
yeah.
Yeah, we Christmas was not canceled but postponed, so we'll be doing a Christmas once she gets settled in.
Well, we're doing the same thing because I'm a boy mama, and so I have three that are married now, so we just kind of go, okay, we'll have Christmas when it works out for y'all. So we're doing Christmas on New Year's Day. So
There you go.
I'm still in the Christmas mood. I mean, we haven't done any of our gifting or anything, and I was looking at some of the clearance candy yesterday, and I was like, nobody would know if I bought it half price, but
That's right.
you know.
No. In fact, I saw a meme yesterday that said it is 364 days until Christmas, and some people already have their lights up. It's unbelievable.
Oh, that's great. And some will leave them up. So don't do that. Take your lights down when you're supposed to. But I think you can leave them up. I think it's okay to leave them up through a little part of January. And my friend Christy Driscoll is about to lose her mind me saying that because she's one of those people. It's like it's the day after Christmas. Take them down now. She wants them down. Right. And so, but I'm cool with you leaving them up through January. Because that's what they do.
Yes.
That's what they do in the Smoky Mountains.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
so we can do that. But, anyway. All right, brother. I want an update. You have been so busy with the American Bible Project. I see you, talking to the governor, and I see all these fun places that you're going and people you're talking to. Yes. Tell me first, when did this start for you? Just remind me of when this started for you.
Sure. Back in 2018, I went out to lunch with my friend Dr. David Black, and many folks may know Dr. Black. Many more folks may know his wife, Diane Black, because she was our congresswoman in D.C. for several years. But at any rate, Dr. David Black and I had gone out for a lunch together, and toward the end of the lunch, he said, "Well, Stephen, you've got to come back to my office and see a book that I picked up recently." And I thought, well, great, yeah, Dr. Black, he's picked up a book, you see. He's been to Barnes & Noble, and he's picked up a book, and we're going to go take a look at it, and that's going to be exciting. So we get back to his office, and we look at this massive bookshelf, and he reaches up. He doesn't pull off a book. He pulls off a box, like a ceremonial box, and he sets the box on the table, and he opens up the box, and inside the box is an antique book. And we kind of stand there in reverential silence for a moment, although I have no idea why we're being so reverentially silent in the presence of this book. And then he says, "Stephen, do you know what you're looking at there?" I said, "No, Dr. Black, I must confess that I don't." He said, "Well, that's an original first American Bible, the only Bible approved by the United States Congress, and the only Bible our government has ever recommended American citizens read." I said, "Wait a minute." I said, "You mean there's a Bible approved by the United States Congress?" He said, "Yes, there is." I said, "Wait a minute. You mean there's a Bible the American government has recommended that all American citizens read?" He says, "Yes, there is, and that's by official proclamation of the date September 12th, 1782. And I said, "Dr. Black, tell me the history of this first American Bible." And at that point, he proceeded to tell me the fascinating history of the first American Bible.
Yeah. Well, and so what's so interesting is then how long after that were you put in touch with the gentleman that had gotten them in his state and the whole program? Because I think there's so much more to that story. So I didn't realize that you had met Dr. Black and learned about the Bible before your meeting with the gentleman that had started the program. What's the timeline on that? Okay.
This was all news to me
when
I was meeting with Dr. Black that day, and I found out that I was standing in the presence of one of only 3 Bibles in the world in private hands. And what I mean to say is that in 1782, there were 10,000 first American Bibles that were printed. This was the first King James Bible made in America by Americans and for Americans. And the way that came about is this. When the American Revolution began, America stopped trade with Britain. And when we stopped trade with Britain, among the many products that we stopped receiving from Britain were Bibles, because Britain is the only place we got our Bibles from. It was the King James Version of the Bible, and Britain's the only place we got it from. So we cut off our supply of Bibles through trade, through the embargo, and to make that matter much worse, and this is the part that everyone always says, come again? It was illegal in America to print the Bible. So it was the home of the free and the land of the brave, but it was against the law to publish God's Word on American soil. The reason for that was that King George maintained a license on the King James Version of the Bible, and King George was not allowing anyone in the American colonies permission to publish the Bible. So between the fact that we had cut off our supply of Bibles through trade, through the embargo, and the fact that we could not print our own Bibles because it was against the law to publish the Bible in America, we ran out of Bibles at the foundation of our nation. And so into that crisis stepped a real hero of American history. It's a man named Robert Aitken. And Aitken is kind of a funny last name we don't use much anymore, but it's spelled Aitken, pronounced like the number 8, and then kin as in your next of kin, Robert Aitken. Robert Aitken is a towering figure in American history for no one to have any idea who Robert Aitken is. But who Robert Aitken is this. Robert Aitken was a first-generation immigrant from Scotland who came to America. He seized the American dream with both hands, and he rose up to become an appointed printer for the Journals of Congress. And everyone knows what the Journals of Congress are. They're tremendously important in our country's history. The Journals of Congress are the collection of all the laws and decrees and resolutions and declarations that founded this nation. It was created so that future generations of Americans could look back on those laws, decrees, resolutions, and declarations that founded this nation. Well, Robert Aitken was the man tasked with making that first Journal of Congress. As a matter of fact, Robert Aitken was the printer for the Journals of Congress when the Declaration of Independence was recorded in the journals. And what I'm trying to emphasize here is that by the very hand of Robert Aitken was the type set that preserved our founding document for you and me and every other American, past, present, and future, to have a way to look back on our founding document. That was the hand of Robert Aitken that preserved that. That was something he could have hung for. That was an act of treason to preserve the founding document of America. And just the same as the rest of our founders in Congress, Robert Aitken could have found himself at the end of a rope if Great Britain had won for that act of treason. But nevertheless, he stood in solidarity with our founders. Well, that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that Robert Aitken had a really big foot in the door with our founders because he was the guy. He was the guy that preserved the founding document for the American public. And so Robert Aitken, he wrote a letter to our founders, and he said, I would like your approval. And the Congress of America was like, well, Mr. Aitken, you're very well known to this distinguished body of founders. What would you like the approval of the government? Now understand, you're asking the approval of the government. What would you like the approval of the government to do, Mr. Aitken? And he said, publish the first American Bible. And so this would be the first King James Bible made in America by Americans and for Americans. And if I could read the minds of everyone that's listening right now, everyone just said the exact same phrase. They said, separation of church and state. Mr. Aitken never should have asked for approval from the government to print the first American Bible because, after all, we understand so well the separation of church and state. And we understand it so well that today we know that what that means is that the government can't come within a country mile of anything to do with religion. Oh, no. You see, if little Johnny prays too loudly in the school cafeteria, well, little Sally might be offended. And so we can't do anything like that because of the, let's all say it together, separation of church and state. So Mr. Aitken, you see, he must not have understood the separation of church and state, as well as we all do today. And you can hear the sarcasm in my voice, I hope, Laverne.
I can, and I know it well because I know the rest of the story, and I want you to unpack for people the separation of church and state argument, since you have brought it up, brother. So I'm explain to them. So
right.
go right ahead. I'll interrupt you when I need to do a commercial, but you just go ahead because people need to hear this.
Right. Well, I'll say that if that is the reaction of our listeners, that they're saying, well, Mr. Aitken must not have understood the separation of church and state for him to ask for the approval of the United States government to publish the first American Bible. And to that, I want to say that if Mr. Aitken didn't understand the separation of church and state, well, then neither did our founders. Because to the shock of history, and certainly to the shock of our supposed understanding of the so-called separation of church and state, Congress approved the printing of the first American Bible by official resolution. So the official resolution is dated September 12th, 1782, and anyone with Google can go and check this out because the records have been digitized and they're now online. So if someone was to search for Journals of Congress, September 12th, 1782, they would see what I'm getting ready to tell you. And probably after I tell you, they're going to want to go and check it out because they're not going to believe what it contains. In the resolution of September 12th, 1782, Congress said two things. The second thing is more shocking than the first to our modern sensibilities, but the first thing that they said was the United States Congress approves the printing of the first American Bible. So this is the first King James Bible made in America, and this is Congress approving the publishing of that first King James Bible in America. The second thing they did, which was really an extra step, which they really didn't have to do, but they did, which gives us real insight into the founders' opinion of the influence of church on government. The second thing they said was, and the United States government recommends that all American citizens read this Bible. So it became not only the first American Bible, and not only the only Bible approved by the United States Congress, but also the only Bible the United States government has recommended for American citizens to read. And that's not only the story of how we got the first American Bible, but it's also a way of saying that if this is the Bible that our government told us to read, well, then finally, the government got something right.
Yeah, very good. And I think that's one of the, when people try to say that we don't have a foundation in faith, they're just absolutely not looking at the facts. And that is such a clear illustration of where we were as a founding nation. We were a place of faith. We were a people of faith. Our leadership was people of faith. And do you want, since you mentioned the separation of church and state, can you speak to that and explain to people where that came about later? Do you speak to that when you present
Sure.
go ahead and explain that, because that's something we have addressed a couple of times on these airways, but I think it's something that we need to be reminded of and to explain to people how that whole phrasing of separation of church and state even came to be something that is uttered and used to try to keep faith and religious organizations out of our schools and out of our public places. So why don't you go ahead and speak to that for us, and then I'm going to take a break after you get through this one. Go for it.
Great. Absolutely. So on the topic of the separation of church and state, if we looked for the phrase separation of church and state in the Constitution, our governing document, we would look long and hard and fruitlessly. We would never, ever, ever find the phrase separation of church and state or anything like it in the Constitution. That's because the phrase a wall of separation between church and state appears nowhere in the Constitution. We don't get it from the Constitution. We get it from a personal letter that was written by then President Thomas Jefferson in reply to a letter written by the Danbury Baptist Association. And this happened in 1802. So in 1802, the Danbury Baptist Association is concerned about the government interfering in their church practices. And they've got good reason to fear. If we look back over the history of our country in America, the Church of England was very well supported by Great Britain, and Baptists were frowned upon. There's even a record of Baptist ministers being imprisoned for preaching the Baptist doctrine as opposed to going along with the Church of England.
Mm-hmm.
So, at any rate, the Danbury Baptist Association of 1802 is writing a letter to then sitting President Thomas Jefferson, and they ask the question, should we be concerned about the government interfering with the church? So, that's the question at hand. Will the government interfere with the church? And to that, Thomas Jefferson writes back an explanation. Now, he will turn the clever phrase, wall of separation between church and state. But in the build-up to turning that clever phrase, he makes it clear that the Danbury Baptist Association does not need to worry about the government interfering with church practices. Mm-hmm. So again, I say, it is not that they are asking, should the church have an influence on government? That is not the topic at hand. Mm-mm. The topic at hand is, does the church need to worry about the government interfering with church practices? And to that, Jefferson, in summary, replies, the church does not have to worry about the government interfering with church practices because, after all, there's a wall of separation between church and state. So what Jefferson was saying was, the church, while the church doesn't have to interfere, have to worry about the interference of government, while the church does not have to worry about the interference of government, he never said that the church should not have an influence on government. He was never saying that. However, that is exactly what we have taken it to mean today. Today we've taken it to mean that the government should not allow any endorsement of religion, or they should not allow any kind of presentation of religion in a public place. So this means that we can't have the Ten Commandments at the local courthouse to illustrate that our laws are based on the Ten Commandments. Neither can we pray before a school football game. This is all because, as we use the handy phrase nowadays, the wall of separation between church and state to mean those things. It was never intended to mean that. It was rather meant to reassure the church that we did not have to worry about the government interfering with church practices. Now, what we do have is the First Amendment, and we have the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, and that is in the Constitution. And what that tells us is that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Well, again, the interpretation that we have shorthanded into the wall of separation between church and state that we use to stop schools from praying before football games, and we use to stop students from praying too loudly in the school cafeteria because other students who don't share their faith may be offended by hearing them pray a blessing over their food. The way that we have taken that is, in my opinion, nowhere supported by the First Amendment. Because, again, what the First Amendment of the Constitution tells us is that Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. By the way, that's two restrictions against government, no restrictions against the church.
Amen.
It's two restrictions against government. Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion, that's the first restriction, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. That's the second restriction. Two restrictions against government, no restrictions against the church. However, within this idea of Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, I would like to key on the fact that what's being talked about there is the establishment of religion. Well, to the founders' mind, and based on the history that they were familiar with, within its context, to talk about the establishment of religion is going to necessitate one of three things, and maybe all three things. But it's going to constitute that the government is going to set some type of financial penalty. They're going to fine a church for preaching outside of what they want to be preached. Okay, so there's going to be a financial penalty, or there's going to be a financial benefit, that if a church is going to preach what the government wants preached, then the government's going to reward the church. There's going to be a financial benefit. And thirdly, there may be some type of imprisonment, some type of penalty that culminates in if the fines don't do it, if we've got a church that's preaching something other than what the government deems to be the established religion of the church or the government, then there'll be some kind of a penalty that may culminate in imprisonment if the church continues to preach, in some way that's not according to what the established church of the government is supposed to be preaching. None of that is happening. None of that is happening. The United States government is not financially benefiting some church in America. The United States government is not financially penalizing some church in America, and the United States government is not imprisoning pastors that are preaching outside of some type of perceived established religion of the United States government. So, again, just looking at what that phrase of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause, meant to the founders within the historical context, we don't see any establishment of a church when a school is allowed to pray before a football game. There's no establishment of a church. There's no government financial incentive. There's no government financial penalty. There's no government-induced imprisonment, the things that the founders would have considered to be part and parcel of the establishment of a religion. That's not happening when we pray before a school football game. That's not happening when we put the Ten Commandments at the local courthouse. But again, we've gotten this phrasing so upside down when we talk about the wall of separation between church and state that we find ourselves in the mess that we're in today.
Right. And the thing, too, to just kind of drive this whole thing home, that letter was written because the Danbury Baptists were in Connecticut in an area that was seeing some state influence and state guidelines and state religion being established. And they were concerned that the state was going to be able to, weigh down on them and prevent them from being able to practice they didn't want the same situation they had with the Church of England and with the king. They didn't want to have, like you said, they didn't want to have that established church from the state. It was a freedom. That's the reason why you had all these different beliefs coming in. That's why you had the Jewish people immigrating. That's why you had people coming in so they could freely practice their religion, and that the state and that the federal government were not going to impose, well, this is the one that you have to practice. And so it is so upside down the way they have distorted that. And at the core of that's the reason why we're having to fight to get the Bible back in the schools, and the reason for what you're doing. Would that be a fair assessment?
That's a fair statement, and I want to say that we have not, unfortunately, gotten as much help as we should have from the courts. That phrase, wall of separation between church and state, entered into case law, I think it was 1948, when it was invoked by the Supreme Court in their brief on a case that they were hearing. The very interesting thing about that is that they used Thomas Jefferson to help interpret constitutional law, which begs the question, well, if they used Thomas Jefferson to help interpret constitutional law, if they used the famous phrase, a wall of separation between church and state, to help to clarify the First Amendment of the Constitution, which is what they were doing there, well, then what did Thomas Jefferson have to do with the writing of the Constitution? Because interpretation of a document 101, at the very, very basic foundational level, what that means is that you look at what the authors of the document wrote in other works that help to shed light on the document you're looking at. So in other words, if you're looking at the Constitution, you're going to look at what the authors of the Constitution wrote in other works, where they provided clarification of their thoughts in other speeches, or they did it in books, or they did it in some other manner, personal letters, something like that. But you're looking at, and we're going to try to interpret the Constitution, the First Amendment, and so we're going to look at what the authors of the First Amendment of the Constitution had written in other works, and that's going to help us to provide clarification for how the First Amendment applies to the current case before the court. Okay, so the question here is, what did Thomas Jefferson have to do with the writing of the Constitution? And the answer is absolutely nothing. Yeah. He had absolutely nothing to do with the writing of the Constitution. How could he have? Not only was he not in Philadelphia, where the Constitutional Convention met, he was never in America at the time. He was in France. He was serving as the ambassador to France for the United States at the time of the Constitutional Convention. So it is extraordinary, to put it nicely, it is extraordinary that the Supreme Court would have taken an author who had nothing to do with the writing of the document that is in question and they chose him because, in my opinion, they could cherry pick a clever turn of phrase and use it to their own ends. They could use it to support their own persuasion at the time, which was that the persuasion at the time was to create that wall of separation, to cement that wall of separation between church and state in the way that it's commonly interpreted now, which is to say that the government cannot allow any religious influence within the public sector insofar as the government oversees that public sector. Our courts, our public school systems, and insofar as they contribute to that, they could not allow any religious influence. So that is, in my opinion, really one of the greatest questionable acts that the Supreme Court has ever enacted, to choose Thomas Jefferson, who had nothing to do with the writing of the Constitution, to help interpret the Constitution. That is extraordinary. The Supreme Court had a host of actual authors of the Constitution to pull from. The reason they didn't, in my humble opinion, is because those other guys, they were way too religious.
Yep.
Their Christianity was worn way too profoundly on their sleeves, and they would never get any kind of a wall of separation between church and state out of those guys, the actual authors of the Constitution. And so instead, they cherry-picked someone who had nothing to do with the writing of the Constitution, simply because Thomas Jefferson had a clever turn of phrase that supported their persuasion.
Yeah. I tell you, let me stop you there, Steve. I'm talking with Stephen Skelton. He's with the American Bible Project, and we wanted to get an update from him as to where we are. We have been a big supporter of this here in Robertson County, and he is going to give us an update on just where we are as far as bringing the Bible back into the schools as a historical document, which it is, and just the fabulous way that they are. We're working within the system, and we're making it work, and we're getting God's word back into our schools, and we've already done that here in Robertson County. So he's going to update us on that and the progress of this amazing program, and and also let you know how you can be a part of it. But we do need to pause for a minute, Stephen, and talk about Riceman & Buick GMC. I was on their website. I'm just fascinated how well their website works, because when you go to ricemanbuickgmc.com, as I said, the first thing that pops up is order my vehicle. Order my vehicle. It's that easy. So many people are seeing that because the inventory is down just across the board when it comes to auto manufacturing, that if they want exactly what they want, they've got to go ahead and order a vehicle. Because a lot of people, they was, I'm never going to do that. I don't want to do that. But then they're seeing how effortless it is. And it's also effortless to go on the website to schedule a service appointment, to schedule a appointment to talk with a salesperson, to go on and even sell your car, get a quote on your car. That's one thing that's really big on the website right now, is letting you know they will buy your vehicle. If you want to get a quote on if you have a vehicle that they can bring onto their lot and make part of their pre-owned stock, they want to talk to you. Todd, when I've talked to him, has said, please don't sell it on Marketplace. Reach out to me and maybe I can buy it from you. But the website works beautifully. You'll see if you go all the way down to the bottom of the page on the website, you'll see their hours, which we talk about. Their sale hours are Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. until 7:30 p.m., Saturday, 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. Well, then you can also see service hours, and you'll see that their hours vary, but they do have service hours every single day that the dealership is open. You can go through and look at their new inventory. You can look at their used inventory. You can even start the leasing and financing process online, fill out that application, and get that process started at a time when people are still very, very cautious about the pandemic and COVID and the new variants, and they have really stepped it up with their website to where it is so user-friendly, effortless to go on and do so much of the work you can do online before you even set foot on the lot. Go and talk to them today. Get on the website, kind of see what you're interested in, then go in and talk with them. Or if you want to give them a call, if you have any questions, you can call them at 615-384-3559, 615-384-3559. Again, Monday through Friday, they're open 8 a.m. until 7:30 p.m., Saturday 8 a.m. until 6 p.m. Friends of this program, sponsors of One Street Over. When you get by there, always please tell them U-Turn sent you. Stephen Skelton is a good friend of this program, good friend of mine actually. You're a Madison guy. I've been at Madison since I got there in 1989. So you were like in probably the youth group when I got there, wouldn't you?
Absolutely, that's true. I was born in '72, and So some point in '72, I started attending Madison Church of Christ.
Yeah, so it's just so you're part of my church family too, and so we're really proud of the work that you're doing. Very excited about it. So, can you just update us? I mean, we could sit here and talk to you about the history. There's so much about the way this Bible is a historical document, and there's a website where you can go in and study this stuff yourself, which is just absolutely fascinating. Stephen's got a wealth of knowledge in his head, as is obvious just talking to him. The point you made about how they've used Jefferson to defend the separation of church and state, and he didn't. I never even thought about that. That was so interesting what you just shared, and that's something I was like, oh yeah, and it hadn't hit me. But we need to move on to talk about. Give us an update on where you guys are in this effort to get the Bible back into schools. So just kind of give us how was 2021? What's the
It's
update?
going very well, actually. And I want to hasten to say that when we talk about putting the Bible back into school, a lot of people have an immediate impression of what that means to put the Bible back in school, and a lot of people are wrong about their immediate impression of what that means to put the Bible back in school. So what we mean when we say that we're putting the Bible back into school is in a very specific way with this very specific Bible that we've been talking about. So the very specific way is through the history departments. Of course, the very specific Bible is the Aitken Bible, the first American Bible, and it's the historical merits upon which it's going back into schools. I want to say that it is not a Sunday school lesson. It is not an examination of scriptures. Rather, it's a history lesson. So it's not a Sunday school lesson, but it's a history lesson. And it is tied into the state academic standards for social studies regarding the American Revolution. What that means is that there are 5 different topics that this Bible serves as an object lesson for. And now you're going to hear me give an example of one of those, and you'll be perhaps impressed upon the historical, even the secular historical nature of how this Bible is being used in school. I had said before that the reason that we have the first American Bible is because of the embargo. Well, that falls underneath the financial factors of the American Revolution. So teachers are already teaching about the financial motivations of the American Revolution, and they're talking about no taxation without representation, that famous phrase that articulated the frustrations of America in being governed by the government of Great Britain without any kind of representation there, and being taxed without any kind of representation there to plead their case. So no taxation without representation the teachers will teach about. And they'll teach about the Boston Tea Party, you know, that famous protest where they dumped the tea into Boston Harbor because of the competition from the Great Britain's government interfering with the tea trade in America, another financial factor. And then finally they'll get up to the big bomb in the economic factors of the American Revolution, which was the embargo, which was the complete cessation of trade between our two countries. In reality, it was when we stopped sending money over to Great Britain to fund the war effort against ourselves, because that's exactly what we were doing when we bought British products. We were sending money over to Great Britain, which in turn would be used to fund the war effort against our country as we filled the British coffers. Well, at any rate, the embargo created the cessation of trade between our two countries. And at the point that the teacher in the classroom is talking about these economic factors of the American Revolution, and they get up to the embargo, they're able to say, students, I have an object lesson for you. I have an artifact of this topic that we're teaching on. Some of you students may have said, well, what kind of products did we stop receiving from Great Britain? And what did we do when we stopped receiving those products? Well, I place in front of you a book. One of the things that happened was we stopped receiving Bibles from Great Britain. The teacher will relate to the students. And the next thing we did was we got self-sufficient. And our spirit of independence in America drove us to create our own product to replace the product we were no longer receiving from Great Britain, and that was this Bible here in front of you. Take it, students. Open it up, read from it, pass it around. It is an authentic reproduction of a primary source document of the American Revolution that helps to illustrate this topic of the embargo that we're talking on here. So you've just heard me give an illustration of the type of secular historical use that this Bible is being put to. And I do just want to again emphasize that some people at the beginning of this project were saying, well, your expectation is unreasonable because you are expecting teachers to become preachers. Nope. We were never expecting teachers to become preachers. We understand that teachers teach, that's in a school, and preachers preach, that's in a church. But when teachers teach, they teach according to the state academic standards. And so if you have a way that your resource connects directly to the state academic standards and the topics that they're teaching on, then you've got a resource that can really add value to the teacher teaching in that classroom on that topic. So the 5 topics that this Bible connects to are these. I mentioned the embargo. It also connects to the economy. It connects to Congress, culture, and immigration. I mentioned before that Robert Aitken was a first-generation immigrant from Scotland who came over and contributed so much to our country's history, and culminating in this first American Bible that he published. So it is within that secular historical use that the Bible is going back into school. It is not going back into school in some type of evangelical endeavor. Rather, it is going back into schools to provide a resource that is an object lesson that connects to the topics that educators are already teaching on according to the state academic standards.
Right. And, and that's one thing, too, that, people just don't realize. This is a way to plant the seed, because the world is telling them that we're not a godly nation, we're not a nation founded on Christian principles, and this does plant that seed of illustration for them to where, so many, we are the mission field now, Stephen. So many people are not aware of any of this because it has been stripped away from our schools. And this is just a way to get it back in front of the kids and say, this is your foundation, and to give that example. And that's why those people like myself, of people of faith, see it as a very good way to start planting these seeds again that have just absolutely been trampled. Would that be a fair statement? And I got to do an ad to just let you comment on that real quickly.
Yes, I think that's absolutely a fair statement. Hey, if we're going to teach history, why don't we teach it correctly?
Right. Exactly. And I tell you, let me go ahead and do a break, but as we come back, I want to get an update on where we are as far as the number of schools that have been, where these Bibles have been placed. What, where are you in regards to your nonprofit and the success that you've seen? Also, too, I have family members that are listening to the show from up in Michigan. And what is the availability for other states to possibly bring this in? Because, we've been focusing a lot on Tennessee. What is the impact in other states as well? So I want to address that if we could when we come out of the break. Would that be okay?
Great.
Okay. Well, and we're going to pause for a minute. We're going to talk about Corbin Creek Greenhouse Gifts and Gardening Store. They're taking a break. So just so you know, they're off between Christmas and New Year's. And so you just kind of be mindful of that. Don't be going out there right there and bothering them because they're just trying to take a little bit of a vacation, and well earned, because man, they work a lot of long hours, especially when we start getting into the spring and into the summer and all those things going on. But as you start preparing for the things that you want to do in the new year, maybe it is doing a special garden. Maybe you've got an area you think, man, I'd like to kind of turn that into just a focal point in my yard. You can take pictures and get an outline and get an idea and go in and talk to Amy, talk to Miss Jane, any of them there at Corbin Creek, and they can help you decide what plants will work, depending on what, you have to look at how much sun does it get, how much shade does it get, and those are the kinds of questions they're going to need. What's your soil like? Those are the kinds of questions that you need. But if you'll go in with those ideas and with that information, they can really help guide you to help you put together something beautiful in spring. And in a minute, it'll be spring, y'all. Time goes so fast. So if you really want to do something impactful in your yard, now's the time to start thinking about that and start planning that. Go in and talk to Amy, Miss Jane, or any of them at Corbin when they reopen at the first of the year. And two, as you're kind of anticipating the things you want to do to better your health in 2022. Are you like me? Do you have a lot of arthritis? Do you have sleep issues? CBD may really be a game changer for you and may be something you really want to incorporate into your daily habits as you start looking at the new year. That is something you can go and talk to them as well. Go onto their webpage or onto their Facebook page. They got a ton of information on their Facebook page, and it's just completely informative about all the things that they have going on. You can check out their hours and exactly what's happening there. But again, they're taking a break this week. Don't go bother them this week. They're just taking a little bit of vacation. But Corbin Creek will be back ready to go in the new year. So next week you can go and check them out, get your CBD products, and start talking to them about how your garden's going to grow in 2022. Corbin Creek, one of our sponsors here at 1 Street Over. When they get back at it, they're going to be open Monday through Saturday, 9 to 4, Sunday from 1 to 4. But again, that's after the new year, so keep that in mind and get ready to go see them once we get back into the new year, but let them enjoy some holiday time. And Merry Christmas, Happy New Year from Corbin Creek Greenhouse Gifts and Gardening Store, one of our sponsors at 1 Street Over. And Stephen Skelton, can you address what we were talking about before the break? So where are we as far as the distribution? Who has these Bibles now? I know we've got them here in Robertson County, and where else have they gone? And what about getting it into other states?
Yes, I want to say that Robertson County was actually the first county in the country to fulfill all three positions that are available for a Bible to go into the hands of the folks at the school. What I mean by that is that
explain that.
In our efforts, what we're doing is we're equipping the teacher standing in front of the 25 students in the class to be able to hold up the Bible and pass out the Bible to the students. That's a classroom copy. It's going to the first teacher teaching the American Revolution in 4th grade, in 8th grade, and the junior year. Those are the 3 times that we teach the American Revolution. Throughout the country, we'll teach it 3 times, and which is to say school systems are teaching the American Revolution 3 times, once in elementary, once in middle school, and then once at the high school level. So within each one of those grade levels, whether it's an elementary school or middle school or a high school, there are 3 places that the Bible could go. There are usually, in almost every school, 2 teachers that are teaching the American Revolution in elementary school grade, 2 teachers teaching the American Revolution in a middle school grade, and 2 teachers teaching the American Revolution in a high school grade. So we look to provide 1 Bible to the first teacher and 1 Bible to the second teacher, because often they're teaching the same topic at the same time. So it's not a matter of sharing the resource. They actually need the resource on the day they need it, but that's 2 different teachers needing the same resource on the same day at the same time. So we try to provide, again, 1 Bible to the first teacher and 1 Bible to the second teacher. The third Bible, for the third position that I mentioned, is for the library. So if you look at an elementary school, let's say, you'll have 2 teachers teaching the American Revolution, same topic at the same time. We'll look to provide a Bible to each one of those 2 teachers. And the third position is for the library, so that when one of the students says, I had never heard about the first American Bible, I would love to show that to my dad. I'd love to show that to my mom. I'd love to show that to my pastor. I'd love to show that to my youth pastor. Can I take it? Well, the teacher will say, well, this is a classroom copy that we've been given to remain in the classroom. However, there is also a copy in the school library, and you can go and you can check out the First American Bible from the school library just the same as you would any other book, and thereby you can take it home and show it to your family and your church family and whoever else you'd like to show it to. So Robertson County became the first county in the nation to actually fulfill all 3 positions, but they have created the model that we look to duplicate in every other county, not only in Tennessee, but throughout the United States, because this is an effort that is nationwide. So far, while we have begun the effort here in Tennessee, we've also seeded into about 11 other states. So there are 11 other states. Some of them, would make sense, I suppose, if we talked about putting the Bible back in schools in Alabama. You'd say that makes sense if I said Kentucky. You'd say that makes sense if I said Texas. You'd say, wait a minute, you haven't already put the Bible back in every single school in Texas? What are you waiting for? I'm kidding. Some of the states, to my mind at least, were a bit surprising, but we've gotten sponsorship in Oregon. We've gotten sponsorship in New Mexico. Both of those are, on the other side of the political spectrum from conservative, which is who you might suspect would support putting the Bible back in school. And within the next 2 weeks, we'll break into California. We'll begin to put Bibles back into schools in California as well, as we find those individuals and organizations within those states who say, we want to put the Bible back in our schools. And that's how we have made the progress that we have made, not only in Tennessee, but also into those other states. So the numbers are, since the beginning of the year when we began distribution, again, we established in 2018, we put ducks in a row. We lined up things for the period up until the beginning of this year when we began distribution of Bibles into schools. And within Tennessee, we have put the Bible back in over 700 schools since the beginning of the year only. And within those other states, we have gotten sponsorship for another 300 Bibles going into the various other states, into schools in those states. And if you add those two figures together, then you're going to come out to the fact that we are rapidly approaching the milestone of 1,000 Bibles back in 1,000 schools. And we are just getting started.
Yeah.
Here in Tennessee, to speak of the progress we've made of the 700 schools and yet the road before us, there are 2,400 schools altogether in Tennessee, counting elementary, middle, and high school, public, charter, and private. That's an all-in figure of 2,400. So while I'm very pleased to say that we have put the Bible back in over 700 schools, that is in reality, a little less than a third of the schools that we've got before us total, 2,400. So we've still got work to do, but again, we are just getting started with this being our first year of distribution. And as folks continue to support the American Bible Project, then we will continue to put the Bible back into our schools.
Absolutely. And I'm going to do one more ad, and then we're going to come back, and I want you to be sure and talk to people how they can become involved if they have an organization, just like my friend, my family up in Michigan. If they're hearing this and they're like, how can we bring this to Michigan? Explain to them how they can get this started and get this going, because I think it's one of those things. I think it's going to become a snowball effect once people realize. I know so much about it because I've known you from really since you started this, but as I've learned more and more about it, I just want more and more people to get this and understand it, because once you hear about it, it's such a good idea. It is such a good idea, and I can just kind of see it kind of snowballing, kind of like getting they put in the Constitution in the schools that program. It kind of started a little bit, when it got started, it was more of a Tennessee thing, and then it's just kind of escalated in such a beautiful way. And I see
in a wonderful way. That's the 917 Society that we're talking about there, run by my dear friend Joni Bryan, and the progress that she has made in putting the founding documents back into the hands of the future of our country is awe-inspiring.
Yeah, and I kind of see this project going the same way. Once people get wind of it, because once people really understood what she was doing, they're like, absolutely, that needs to happen. And so I believe that as more and more people understand what the American Bible Project is all about, and you've got Dr. Ming Wang on board, you've got Dr. David Black on board, and so, and that is still the case, correct?
Oh, that's true, yes. Dr. Ming Wang is our president.
Right. He's
the president of the Founders Club of the American Bible Project, and Dr. Black is our vice president. He is the vice president of the Founders Club of the American Bible Project. So I affectionately refer to them as the two titans.
There you go.
But yes, Dr. Ming Wang and Dr. David Black are integral to the American Bible Project.
You better believe it. And we'll talk a little bit more about how you can become involved, because we're just about the same amount of time. I could have given you a couple hours, Stephen. I knew that we would have plenty to talk about, but I do need to pause for a minute and talk about Barry and Rebecca Richards with the Exit Realty Garden Gate team here at the end of the year, the first of the year. These are the times that do you want to list your property? This is when we make decisions, I think, a lot of times. A lot of us kind of get to the end of the year, anticipating the new year, and it's like, is this going to be the year that we decide to sell? Is this going to be the year we decide to buy? Decision making. If you need somebody that you just want to talk to about the housing market and just maybe weigh out the idea about, is this the right time for me? Give them a call. Reach out to them. You can go to sellwithbecky.com or buyrobertsoncounty.com. And they're a great team to have on your side, no matter whether it's buying or selling, because they've been at it a long time. Barry's a marketer. He came out of a marketing career. So if you're selling, you need somebody to make sure that people know your property is for sale. He is a licensed and insured drone pilot, does a 360-degree virtual reality home tour, is a licensed and insured drone pilot, so he can do that drone footage that so many people want. We'll get you up on realtor.com. People are going to know your property is for sale. Now, Rebecca, she's been at this much longer than Barry. He's always been a part of her team, but he went full-time with real estate a few years ago. But she's one of the first in the area to be a seniors real estate specialist, which illustrates she's always studying, always looking for those certifications, those little edges that she can bring to the table to make sure that you're properly represented, no matter whether you're buying or selling. If you've got questions about, is 2022 the year that I need to jump into the water and buy or sell? Call them. Reach out to them. I say call them, but just reach out to them at sellwithbecky.com, sellwithbecky.com, or robertsoncounty.com. They're part of our neighborhood. They're in Cross Plains. They've been there for over 20 years, and they buy and sell in the surrounding counties across the state line in Kentucky, but their specialty is Robertson County. Talk to them today, sellwithbecky.com, or robertsoncounty.com, and talk to them about all your questions that you may have with the real estate market in the upcoming year, and tell them U-Turn sent you. Steve Skelton is here. We've got just a few minutes, my friend. So how can people become involved? What do they need to do if they want to help you with this project?
Absolutely. Thanks for asking. To put a Bible back into a school, it's $100. It's $100 to put the Bible back into a school. Dr. Wang had established the Founders Club of the American Bible Project, and early on he had said to me, Stephen, you've got a wonderful way to put the Bible back in school. I said, thank you, Dr. Wang. He said, let me finish. You've got a wonderful way to put the Bible back in school that is doomed to failure.
Oh, no.
I said, Dr. Wang, you took me to the top of the mountain, wonderful way to put the Bible back in school, and then you threw me down in the valley. It's doomed to failure. What do you mean? He said, I've been involved in countless nonprofits, and the ones that have all failed for the same reason. They have failed to prioritize their funding. They have been so focused on the excitement generated by the good work they were doing that they failed to focus on the funding. So he said, I'm going to do you a favor you can never repay. He said, I'm going to establish a Founders Club, and this is what we're going to do. He said, how many schools do we have here in Tennessee to begin with? I said, there's 2,400 schools. He said, great. He said, the way we're going to do this is by 5s, 10s, and 20s. 5 schools here, 10 schools there, 20 schools there. He said, first level of membership into the American Bible Project, sponsor 5 schools. It's a $500 donation, sponsors 5 schools to put the Bible back in those schools. He said, second level, he says, if you can do more, sponsor 10 schools. It's a $1,000 donation at $100 per school, 10 schools. So sponsor 10 schools, and we'll put the Bible back in those 10 schools. He said, third and final level, for someone that can do more, sponsor 20 schools. It's a $2,000 donation. Puts the Bible back in 20 schools. And I said, Dr. Black, I said, and Dr. Wang, I said, I told you, gentlemen, there's 2,400 schools in Tennessee alone, and you're telling me that we're going to get to 2,400 schools by 5s, 10s, and 20s? I said, no, sir. I said, what we need somebody to say, hey, I'll sponsor 100 schools, and then somebody else to say, I'll sponsor 100 schools, and someone else to say, I'll sponsor. I said, and that's the way you make progress. And that's the way you do 2,400 schools in the state, is by people stepping up and saying, I'll sponsor 100, I'll sponsor 100, I'll sponsor 100, and lickety-split, you do it that way. Well, I want to tell you, as we talk today, having put the Bible back in over 700 schools in Tennessee alone, with another 300 sponsored in the other states, we did not do 1,000 Bibles in 1,000 schools by someone saying 100 here, 100 there, and 100 there. No. We did it in much smaller steps. We did it by 5s, 10s, and 20s. So they're right. I was wrong, and I'm declaring that publicly, but the way that illustrated to me that great things can be accomplished in small steps, 5 schools here, 10 schools there, 20 schools there, that's the way that we've put nearly 1,000 Bibles into 1,000 schools, and that's the way we're going to continue to operate. So when you ask how you can support the American Bible Project, please go by the website, which is theamericanbible.org. Don't forget the "the." This is not any American Bible. It is the first, the American Bible. So at the website, theamericanbible.org, you can go there and do a deep dive on the history of the project, and you can also find out about how you can support putting the Bible back into the schools of your community and your country.
Very good. And we're completely out of time, Stephen. God bless you. I knew that it would be an interesting time, and I appreciate the update. And just keep us apprised of everything going on anytime that you need any time just to come on and let people know where you're at and what you need. The door and the airways are always open for you, my friend.
Oh, great. Thank you so much for having me, Laverne.
Thank you, Stephen Skelton with the American Bible Project, theamericanbible.org, correct?
That's right.
theamericanbible.org. Get involved. Make a difference in 2022. Thank you, brother, and God bless to your mom as well.
Thank you, Laverne. God bless.
Thank you so much, and thank you guys for joining us here on One Street Over. Tomorrow, Debbie Keenan will be joining me to talk about all things going on here with the Let's Talk Trash News, and also their fundraiser that they're going to have coming up in the schools. And just, she's my friend, and we're going to chit-chat about all that she has going on, and we hope you'll be here for all that we have going on this week on One Street Over. God bless. Have a wonderful day. This is 1100 WSGI.
You're so faithful. You're so holy. You're so perfect. You're so near. You're so near. You're so close. We acknowledge your presence in this place. Oh, Father, we acknowledge your presence in this place.